Hello Year 11. Something a little bit different today. Rather than keep practicing those language skills, which I know you're all fairly good at anyway, there is a writing exercise at the end of this seminar, but I thought I'd deliver you a little seminar on H.G. Wells, his life and politics. There is a creative exercise at the end as well for you to practice some skills, but yeah, I thought it might be of interest to you. Affliction comes to us not to make us sad but sober, not to make us sorry but wise. H.G. Wells, highly quotable. If I had heroes, he'd definitely be one of them. But an interesting quote there, particularly for these times. So there you are. Moving on, we're going to be looking at the life and politics of H.G. Wells. Just we need to establish, excuse me, up front what is capitalism and what is socialism. I'm sure you know, having looked at, rather studied an Inspector Calls, capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. And socialism is a political and economic theory of social organisation which advocates that the means of production, distribution and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Not necessarily the state, but the community as a whole in some way. This is, I'm sure you recognise this quote, people. We can't let these Bernard Shaws and H.G. Wellses do all the talking. We hard-headed practical businessmen must say something sometime. Who would say there's a capitalist or a socialist? Well, I think we can all agree that that's the sort of thing that a capitalist would say. Right, here's a brief biography of H.G. Wells, just give you a bit of background on the man. Born on the 21st of September 1866, means he was a sort of a Victorian, but by the time he reached maturity, certainly where his writing was concerned, it was the Edwardian age. He broke his leg at the age of 8. While bedridden, he read Dickens and became familiar with the themes and characters. He read all of Dickens many, many times, and he was very young. It's interesting because I read lots of H.G. Wells when I was that age, or a little bit older as well, for similar reasons, and it had quite a profound effect on me, I think. So knowing what we know about Dickens, you know, what were Dickens's political views? What influence would they have had on Wells? Well, if you don't know and you haven't read much Dickens, he was famously a sort of nascent socialist himself, and he felt that I mean, he wrote they were kind of soap operas, really, Dickens. That's why, if you've ever read any, they're so episodic, because they were originally published in the Strand magazine, and people would rush to buy them every week to see what happened to the characters on a weekly basis, which makes the books very dense and episodic. That's both good and bad. I mean, you can read sort of each chapter of Dickens, certainly of the early and mid Dickens, as each chapter is almost a standalone story on its own. But he was very much in the business of showing people, the middle and upper classes in Victorian and Edwardian England, the kind of lives that working class people led. The class system was very rigid back then, and people of the middle and upper classes had no idea the sorts of conditions that the working classes lived in. So that would have, at that tender age of 8, would have had a very profound effect on H.G. Wells. He was by no means an upper class person himself. He's very lower middle, but yeah, it would have made him, in today's vernacular, made him into a left-leaning writer. Well, Wells decided he wanted to be a writer after reading so much Dickens, but he had to put his ambitions on hold when, due to the family finances, he had to go to work as a draper's apprentice. So they came under some financial pressure in the family when he was sort of 14 or 15, and this effectively was manual labour. What type of people do you think this would have exposed him to, and what effect would it have had on him? Now, he was lower middle class. He certainly wouldn't have spent any time in his short life up till then with people who were labourers and working class. but this forced him to have to do that. And always in these situations, when people are exposed to other people of other classes, they develop an empathy for them, which is exactly what H.G. Wells did. So you compound that with Dickens' political views, then he realises that people in the working classes aren't some kind of horrible monsters that you can't interact with. They're just ordinary people. Excuse me. That's the effect it had on him. So very early in his life, his outlook was shaped. Anyway, he got back to his studies in 1890 and was awarded a BSc in zoology and geology. So a bit of what we nowadays might call an all-rounder. He's an aspiring writer, but he's also got a bachelor's degree in zoology and geology. And how would that have affected his thinking? That would have brought a very much a discipline to his writing, and he would have been on the sort of ground floor of discussions at the university about evolution and its potential clashes with religion and so on. So yes, an interesting time to be alive for H.G. Wells, and an interesting sort of route through to maturity there with Dickens, and then having to do manual labour, and then doing a degree in zoology and geology. So a scientist who writes, they're relatively rare, but when they do appear, they're inevitably very effective, as H.G. Wells was. Right, Woking. We need to talk briefly about his time in Woking, which was actually very short. It was a year. He was in 1895 to 1896, but he was incredibly productive in that time. He planned the War of the Worlds, which you've probably heard of. People still making films with Tom Cruise in based on that story. He wrote an innovative book about cycling called The Wheels of Chance, and completed his other possibly, those two are the most famous, aren't they? The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. And in that year he made £1,096, which is the equivalent of £120,000 today. So he did rather well that year that he spent in Woking. And there's a little quote here about what inspired him, or the moment of inspiration that led to him writing The Time Machine. At that time I was living in Woking, and one day walking on the Horsell Common there came to me suddenly a vivid picture clean into my head of the invaders just arrived in one of those interplanetary cylinders which I borrowed from their inventor Jules Verne. So it was on Horsell Common, where a lot of, or certainly the early part of the War of the Worlds takes place, that Herbert George was walking, and he had the inspiration for The Time Machine, a story which many aspects of now still resonate very, very strongly now. An intelligent man, he couldn't help but get involved in political thinking, and his most consistent political idea was the world state. He stated in his autobiography that from 1900 onward he considered a world state inevitable. He envisioned the state to be a planned society that would advance science, end nationalism, and allow people to progress by merit rather than birth. He was an incredible optimist, as you can see. Wells's 1928 book, The Open Conspiracy, argued that groups of campaigners should begin advocating for a world commonwealth, governed by a scientific elite that would work to eliminate problems such as poverty and warfare. Later in his life, he would meet both Roosevelt and Stalin. Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful idea, isn't it? That somehow morphed into communism, which doesn't work, because communism was run, along the same ideas, but not run by technicians. It wasn't run by scientists. It was run by ideologues, and ended up being totalitarian. And we all know how that went with Russia and Nazi Germany was set up initially, the National Socialists, as a socialist state. Neither Stalin or Hitler can claim to be socialists in any way that H.G. Wells had in mind. Certainly not scientists, either of them. So, and we all know what happened with those two: millions dead, and the world on fire. but that wasn't immediately obvious at that time. It was a little bit later that George Orwell spotted the way things were going with the likes of Russia and so on. But at that time, it's reasonable for H.G. Wells to have met Stalin. He didn't realise the way things were going to pan out, and he was an optimist for this world commonwealth. It's important to understand that Wells was a socialist and not a communist. He was anti-Marxist. As I've just said, he could already see what was going on with Marxism and the ideological nature of it. It wasn't empirical enough for H.G. Wells as a scientist. He wanted scientists and technicians to be running the world rather than people who can excite crowds, point fingers and blame people. So that's why he was anti-Marxist and a socialist. Right, we're going to look at The Time Machine brilliantly here. If you haven't read it, you should. It's very good. All H.G. Wells is fantastic. It's very accessible for a Victorian Edwardian writer. I would argue more so than Jekyll and Hyde. I'm not saying Jekyll and Hyde's not as good. It is, but it's harder to read, as is a lot of Victorian and early Edwardian literature. But H.G. Wells, I think possibly because of his scientific background as well, led to a much clearer prose. A brilliant inventor tells his dinner guests that he has built a time machine. He describes the machine in detail and later uses it to travel to the distant future. He meets the Eloi, a race of gentle people plagued by the Morlocks, a race of masters who live underground and feed upon the Eloi. The time traveller must battle the Morlocks to retrieve his time machine. He does get it back. Then he travels to a future where all humanity has been wiped out and replaced with large animals and plants. Humans have gone. And importantly, he returns to the present, realising that humanity doesn't have control over its environment. I think what's currently going on emphasises that, and can only endeavour to have a positive impact on the future. And this is, a wonderful quote from H.G. Wells. No politics of despair, no finger pointing, blame, so on and so forth. Humanity must continue to aspire no matter what. What he's saying is we don't have the control we sometimes think we do over our environment and our lives as a community, but we must continue to be forward-looking and to be aspirational. That's one of the reasons why I like this man. Fantastic quote that. I think I might put that on my wall. Right, link these quotes from the Time Machine to elements of H.G. Wells's background. I saw great. This is him travelling forward in the in his time machine. I saw great and splendid architecture rising about me, more massive than any buildings of our time, and yet as it seemed built of glimmer and mist. How can you link this to Wells's scientific background? Well, I would argue that. Well, let's go through them all first, and then we'll go back over them. The upper world. This is when he's gone into the future, where there's the Eloi on the top and the Morlocks underground. The upper world people might once have been the favoured aristocracy. The people who've got all the money and can sit around all day doing, very little, or possibly getting involved in the world of ideas and culture. The favoured aristocracy, and the Morlocks, their servants, the people who worked all the machinery and worked the infrastructure, made things happen, got food made, got transport sorted, but that had long since passed away. How can you link this to Wells's views on class? And the Eloi, who live on the top, want for nothing. They get fed. Well, they don't know what they get fed. We'll find that out in a bit. They get fed on a daily basis, and they've got shelter. The only problem they've got, and they're not really aware of it, are the Morlocks. So under the new conditions of perfect comfort and security, that's where the Eloi live, up on the top. That restless energy that with us is strength would become weakness. So they have been living this privileged life, the Eloi. This is in the future. This privileged life on the surface, and they've become weak. They're not curious. They're not aspirational. They just dozing through the days. How can you link this to Wells' political views? Now, the underworld, where the Morlocks live underground, being in contact with machinery and still requiring thought and habit, so they're down there working what infrastructure's left, you know. I can't think what it was they were doing now. They were making food because they were eating the Eloi, but they got machines that that do things down there. They got modes of transport down there, and they still have to think about things because they've got to keep that machinery running, and you know, ideally, I guess, improve it and so on. They've retained the shreds of intelligence, very brutal, but they've retained the shreds of intelligence, and therefore became the masters from beneath. So on arrival, it looked like the Eloi with his favoured aristocracy lived on the top in perfect security, but the Morlocks were underground, running all the machinery, and in fact harvesting the Eloi. They eat them. So how can you link this to Wells' time as a manual worker? There's a couple of links you could make there. And then this is when he gets his machine back and he goes further and further into the future, towards the end of the star that keeps this planet alive's life. So many millennia into the future, and he stops and he's on this beach. There's obviously no people about anymore. Very little life. I looked about to see if any traces of animal life remained, but I saw nothing moving in earth or sky. The green slime on the rocks was the only testimony to life. So he's gone millions and millions of years into the future, and all that's left is this green slime on rocks. Everything else has come and gone. So how can you link this to Wells's scientific views? So for the first one, I think I saw great and splendid architecture rising about me, more massive than any building of our time, and yet as it seemed built of glimmer and mist. I mean, to me, how can you link this to Wells's scientific background? The science has made him believe that technology is capable of anything. He has in fact written a story called The Crystal Egg, which almost prophesies the internet. But he, you know, his scientific background tells him there that man is capable of, you know, building practically anything. And the second one, the upper world people might once have been the favoured aristocracy and the Morlocks their servants, but that had long since passed away. How can you link this to views Wells on class? Well, how can you? He sees the sort of elites, the artistic elites, as very sort of fey and frankly not particularly useful. The world of paradoxically with H.G. Wells, the world of literature and ideas was one that he liked, but he didn't see any sort of practical use for it. He saw a place for it, but no practical use for it, and I think he always favoured technicians and science more. So under the new conditions of perfect comfort and security, that restless energy which with us is strength would become weakness. How can you link this to Wells's political views? Well, it's kind of the idea of this makes him a socialist. You need to be constantly questing forward and pushing in an aspirational way, which is on the side of mankind. I'm not putting this very well. On the side of mankind, which is a socialist view. The next one, the underworld, being in contact with machinery and still requiring thought and habit, had retained the shreds of intelligence and therefore become the masters from beneath. Well, the fact that he's got the Morlocks as these horrible flesh-eating creatures probably tells us that on the surface that his time as a manual worker wasn't particularly pleasant for a lower middle class young man who hadn't done anything like that before. There are other stories of his where there's a kind of grudging affection shown for the uneducated, I would say. But he does, however, respect and see the power and the importance of manual work and low-level technical work. I looked about me to see if any traces of animal life remained, but I saw nothing moving in earth or sky. The green slime on the rocks was the only testimony to life. How can you link this to Wells's scientific views? Well, to me, you know, he sees all of life as equally robust in a way, that we don't have any particular claim to the planet, and that we will come and go like civilizations and other animals, and who've had mastery of the planet. The only one we know about is the dinosaurs, and the fact is the dinosaurs are the last animals that had total control of the Earth that we could actually even know about anyway, because there aren't any, the Earth doesn't hold records that go back any further than that. It's impossible. So, and the Earth's been around for a lot longer than the 60 million odd years ago it was that the dinosaurs were around. So whole civilizations could have come and gone, or I'm sure have come and gone before the dinosaurs. There's just no record of them, and he grasped that and saw how tenuous was humankind's hold on the planet. Right, there's a little creative exercise for you to do here if you want. I want you to write a scene between Mr. Burling and H.G. Wells. Mr. Burling, the capitalist, the capitalist from An Inspector Calls, and H.G. Wells. I want you to write a scene perhaps as if they were debating. Mr. Burling, but the way some of these cranks talking right now, you'd think everybody has to look after everybody else, as if we were all mixed up together like bees in a hive. I've learnt in the good hard school of experience that a man has to mind his own business and look after him and his own. I want you to, well, I would say in pairs, but you're on your own. So write a scene between Mr. Burling and H.G. Wells as if they were debating. Your scene should begin with the quote above. There we are, and I've given you some background. But anyway, I hope that was of interest. And H.G. Wells is an absolutely fantastic writer. If you're looking for someone new to read, I would recommend H.G. Wells. There's I've got a copy here, the complete that I've had since I was about very young, I would say 10. The complete short stories of H.G. Wells, which I know inside out, that book. There's a rather lovely quote here actually that I found in a story called The Star, and it came to mind with this pandemic going on, but just because it sort of it makes me think about how it's going to be when we all begin to find our way back into life again. The star is like a meteor that passes close by to the Earth and causes terrible commotion on the Earth. The shapes of the continents are changed, people are washed out to sea, and the only people that survive it are some ships that get out to sea and then come back in once the danger's passed. And here's the quote: "Such few ships that had escaped the storms of that time came stunned and shattered and sounding their way cautiously through the new marks and shoals of once familiar ports." Makes me think of us getting back to our lives again after this. Things will be different but the same. Hopefully better but the same. Anyway, thanks you, 11, and I'll put another one of these up next week on Russian literature if anyone's interested. Enjoy.